Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Critical Wade Theory. And today we're going to be looking at the myth of musical originality. That's what is on my mind today for this show. And we're going to look at, a little bit of a behind the music sort of thing for Jimi Hendrix. We're tackling the fascinating and sometimes controversial topic of musical originality. Is any musician truly original, or is innovation just a sophisticated blend of past influences? So let's explore the idea by looking at legendary artists like the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and Jimi Hendrix, as I mentioned. I'll throw a few others into the mix as well. So, ironically, the this very episode was inspired by a Far Out magazine online piece by Aaron Starkey titled "The Musician Jimi Hendrix Stole His Entire Look From." But I'm going to try not to steal my entire episode from him. But he does bring up a lot of the same points that many people, I think, would bring up while discussing originality in music, especially when it comes to classic rock. Let's be real here. The author that I'm sort of borrowing from took elements that existed elsewhere and pulled them together in an article form, expanding on his talking points in some ways for his own piece, just like I will take some elements and sources from him and expand on them in my own way. For example, his article does not quote Mike Bloomfield, who is a famous musician, but my podcast episode will do that. I'm going to try to be a little bit original, which I'm sure he tried to do with his article. And I'll just say it, a lot of Starkey's article just cites things that are fairly common knowledge. Like that Led Zeppelin has been accused not only of borrowing, but outright stealing ideas from other musicians, especially blues musicians. But also another rock band, the main opening riff to Stairway to Heaven was the subject of a lawsuit, for example. And that's really one of the most famous cases of alleged musical plagiarism. But, Led Zeppelin got away with it. The judge sided with them. And, maybe he was a fan of Led Zeppelin or something. Maybe that's how they got away with it. I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to be accused of defamation here, but I'm just saying, they did get away with it. If you were to listen to the song in question, you would find out that holy crap, that actually does sound a bit like Stairway to Heaven, maybe even a lot like Stairway to Heaven. But the court case did demonstrate that the chord possession or progression possession, I almost said, but the chord progression was used in earlier pieces before, the band that accused Led Zeppelin of taking it. The chord progression existed before they came up with their song. So, the point was, well, if you could sue Led Zeppelin, then maybe that band could be sued as well for common chord progression. And of course, you get into the debate of it's not it's not the notes you play, it's how you play it, and does it become a different musical piece if it's recontextualized? If you add certain effects to the guitar or whatever instrument, does it become a different musical piece? The difference in production could be a factor. All sorts of things like that come into question, and I don't think these topics of originality will ever fully be settled in or outside of a courtroom. But there's nothing wrong with taking common chord progressions or common knowledge and formulating an article about them or a song with them. It's really just a matter of preference, even when it comes to the legal stuff, because the judge, if he had a different point of view, he could have been swayed in the opposite direction, right? And I'm sure it doesn't hurt that Led Zeppelin's a pretty wealthy rock band, and they probably had some decent lawyers that other people could not very easily afford. So, I'm going to progress with the episode here. Borrowing from the past, musical innovation often stems from blending existing influences. The Beatles, for example, took inspiration from Little Richard, as the article notes that I'm kind of borrowing from. The Far Out magazine by Mr. Starkey, that article. He notes that the Beatles borrowed from Little Richard, and it's also true that his energetic vocal style, at the time, it was original, and somebody might have claimed, if you're being as energetic as he was, that, whoa, you're ripping off Little Richard. But that's another thing you get into, is if you have an energetic stage performance, are you necessarily ripping off another artist, or is it just that you're also excited about performing the song, or what have you? And you could say the same thing about, you know a lot of punk rock songs have similar riffs, and you could find riffs that are basically identical, and you get into the question of, did they actually rip something off, or is it just identical to another riff by coincidence? Because it's hard to be original. It really is. Especially when you're playing simpler, power chords or cowboy chord songs. You know, you're gonna get some crossover, whether it's intended or not. And as I mentioned, Led Zeppelin ended up being more openly admitting to their blues musician rip-offs, or whatever you want to call them, because, well, for one thing, they were sued, but in some cases, it was simply undeniable. There was a lot of direct borrowing, whether intentional or subconscious. Their music carried the echoes of the past, and it reinforced a long-standing tradition. And, well, at the time, it wasn't a long-standing tradition, because rock and roll was fairly new. But now, when artists do that, it's considered more of a long-standing tradition in rock music to, sort of borrow from other bands. And that was true of the blues too, for that matter. I'm sure some old blues men got into arguments over, other artists trying to steal their style, or whatever. I think, well, I don't just think, but there were actually cases of bluesmen legitimately, or I should say illegitimately, stealing other people's entire identities, and going on the road claiming to be that blues person. That's another fascinating aspect of this. So it's not only like a song or a portion of a song that could be, unoriginal, but some blues artists would actually go on tour illegitimately claiming to be somebody else. Musical identity theft, and really the most, in the most dramatic sense. So that's another fascinating thing about this. But if you fast forward to today, we see, some of the same patterns in modern music, especially in the art of sampling. Like James Brown's Funky Drummer is one of the most sampled tracks in history, and it's sort of the backbone of a lot of different hip hop and pop songs. I'm not even sure how many. It's probably almost countless at this point. So I think if you were to sue everybody who was to sample that song at this point, you'd be in courtrooms for the rest of your life. You know, So that's one of the funny aspects of this too is who has the time to track all of this stuff down? At a certain point, you're just going to have to compromise on these issues of originality because there's always going to be somebody who's kind of ripping somebody off a little bit. So now we're going to get into Jimi Hendrix as promised. So he was a revolutionary musician in some respects, but also a product of his time. It came up with a lot of classic guitar riffs and a lot of classic songs and whatnot. But you know, he wasn't just a groundbreaking musician. He wasn't entirely original. You know, Hendrix. He transformed rock music with his innovations. Like his use of effects and distortion and wah pedals, and he had a lot of electrifying stage uh, performances. But even that, like the whole thing where he was getting the theatrics with his guitar, that was at least kind of borrowed from Pete Townsend from The Who. He was kind of famous for being one of the first rock star, maybe the first, to start destroying his guitars as part of the performance. And that kind of led to Jimi Hendrix using lighter fluid on his guitar and doing what looked sort of like a voodoo ritual, setting fire to it. And that really, it upped the ante, I guess you could say. I don't really gamble, so I don't even know exactly what that expression means, but I think it's appropriate here. Are You Experienced was a game changer. It stunned audiences and inspired established guitarists like Pete Townsend and Mike Bloomfield. Bloomfield once described his first time hearing Jimi Hendrix play. He said, H bombs were going off, guided missiles were flying. I can't tell you the sounds he was getting out of his instrument. He was getting every sound I was ever to hear him get right there in the room with a Stratocaster, a Fender Twin Amp, a Maestro fuzzbox, and that was Jesus Christ. I can't talk today. But but anyway, Bloomfield said he had melded them into a perfect blend. So that was really one of the senses in which he was innovative. Plus, of course, Jimi Hendrix did have just some good songs. Putting the theatrics aside, putting his wild guitar playing aside, he did craft some all time classic songs, and it seems like you know at a certain point toward the end, Jimmy was sort of having mixed feelings about his musical direction because, on the one hand, yes, he did have this stage presence and this look and all these dynamics that were going on. But you can even, I mean, I'm not trying to pick on him here, but you can even tell by listening to some of his live performances that he was starting to kind of phone it in a little bit. Like, I'm not trying to be Mr. Mean Critic here, but you can just kind of tell that his heart wasn't in it as much at a certain point, and it wasn't just drugs or alcohol or whatever. I think he was starting to, just lose direction with where he was headed musically, and that's why he was trying to expand into more of a jazz influence. He was near the time of his death. He was talking about going in more of a jazz oriented direction, and I doubt he would have totally abandoned his rock focus and that entire style. But he's probably trying to get more experimental and maybe a little bit more dynamic, more like a serious composer or something along those lines. Instead of being pigeonholed as a rock guitarist, I think he wanted to be seen as something, you know, more diverse. But of course, that got cut short when his life was cut short. So I guess the question is, was Hendrix a completely unique artist? Not quite. He openly credited great blues players as his inspiration, and he had an iconic look, but as the Far Out article notes, the psychedelic fashion and hippie aesthetic wasn't entirely his own. Arthur Lee, the frontman of the band Love, has claimed that Hendrix borrowed his style after seeing Lee's 1966 album cover. You know, uh, Here's what Arthur Lee said. He said, his brother told me that Jimi Hendrix took a look at my first album and said, I think I'll try it this way. He stole my dress attire, mate, and I don't appreciate that shit. But, he admits, I can't play the guitar like him at all. So, it's a it's a fact that when it comes to musical styles and fashions, nobody is truly 100% original. But the bigger picture here is a broader truth that musical originality is often romanticized. The reality is that artists build upon what came before. Hendrix did revolutionize music, but he did so by reinterpreting and blending elements from the past, like every other artist that has been influential down the ages. It's not necessarily a flaw. It's part of artistic growth. It's sort of the essence of the creative process. So that's whether it's the Beatles, Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, or today's big stars. The true innovation comes from reworking existing ideas in fresh and unexpected ways. That's really what a lot of innovation is defined as. You don't necessarily reinvent the wheel every time you get into the car, right? So, what do you think? Is true musical originality a myth, or do some artists break the mold more completely than others? Let us, or let me know your thoughts by reaching out on social media, or you can leave a comment if there's a comment section wherever you see this podcast. If it's on YouTube, feel free to subscribe and click like and all that stuff. So, thanks for tuning in to Critical Weight Theory. If you enjoyed the episode, again, don't forget to subscribe. You can leave a review, all that jazz. So, until next time, keep exploring the music that moves you and, you know, try to be original if you can. Be an innovator. Don't just be a follower. But at the same time, respect your roots.